Two young black men are framed and dragged into court. When their true identities are revealed, the judge doesn't back down. He laughs, then locks them away for life. Why would a judge ignore the truth? What is he hiding? And how far will these agents go to expose the system that betrayed them? The answers will shock you. Judge sentences innocent twins to life in prison, unaware they're undercover FBI agents. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the quiet FBI office as Zayden and Zion Carter sat before their handler's desk. The twin brothers, though identical in appearance, carried themselves differently. Zayden sat straight-backed and analytical, his fingers lightly drumming against his knee, while Zion's posture was more relaxed, his eyes warm and attentive, occasionally glancing at his brother for silent confirmation. Despite their differences in demeanor, anyone watching could sense the unspoken bond between them, a connection forged in both blood and shared purpose. Supervisory Special Agent Diane Keller spread several files across her desk, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun that emphasized her no-nonsense expression. The lines around her eyes had deepened over her 20 years with the Bureau, each one earned through difficult cases just like this one. Her office, sparse but meticulously organized, reflected her approach to the job, focused, efficient, and leaving no room for unnecessary distractions. "This isn't like your previous assignments, boys," she said, her voice carrying the weight of concern that she rarely displayed. "What we're dealing with in Montgomery County goes deep, deeper than anything you've tackled before." Her fingers tapped nervously on the desk edge, a small tell that the twins had learned meant genuine worry from their usually unflappable handler. Zayden leaned forward, studying the photographs of Judge Randall Whitmore's courthouse with the careful attention he gave to every detail. The imposing white columns of the building seemed to represent authority itself. "The sentencing disparities are impossible to ignore," he noted, his finger tracing along a statistical chart that showed clear, disturbing patterns. "These numbers tell a story nobody wants to hear." His voice remained calm, but his eyes hardened as he absorbed the information. "That's right," Diane confirmed, tapping a manicured nail against the document. "Judge Whitmore's rulings show a clear pattern that can't be explained away by coincidence. Black defendants consistently receive sentences 3 times longer than white defendants for identical crimes. Same charges, same evidence, vastly different outcomes." She pushed another folder toward them, this one filled with victim statements that had never made it to official records. Zion picked up another file, his brow furrowing as he read through the testimonies and reports. The faces of those affected seemed to stare back at him from the pages. "Sheriff Donnelly seems to be Whitmore's enforcer," he observed quietly, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "Working hand in glove to keep this system running." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "These families, they've lost years they can never get back. From tomorrow morning, you'll be Derek and Marcus Fields," Diane explained, sliding them their new identification papers, each detail meticulously crafted to withstand scrutiny. "You're outreach workers from Atlanta, monitoring court proceedings for a nonprofit initiative focused on judicial transparency. It's the perfect cover to observe without raising immediate suspicion." She handed them each a business card with their new organization's logo, Justice Watch Initiative, professionally designed to look established and legitimate. The twins exchanged glances, a silent communication honed since childhood. They'd done undercover work before, but this felt different, more personal. The weight of responsibility settled on their shoulders like a physical burden. In that brief look, they conveyed both determination and apprehension, a wordless conversation that spoke volumes about the dangerous path ahead. "No contact with the Bureau unless absolutely necessary," Diane emphasized, her tone leaving no room for debate. "We can't risk compromising your cover. One slip could not only end the investigation but put you both in danger." She closed the main case file with a decisive snap. "Trust your training and trust each other." Later that evening, in their family home filled with photographs and memories, Janelle Carter hugged her sons tightly. The retired teacher's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall, her strength another lesson she'd taught them over the years. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered, straightening Zion's collar the way she'd done since they were boys heading off to their first day of school. The photo of their father in his police uniform watched over them from the mantel, his principled stance against corruption having shaped both their careers. Zion touched the small Bible in his bag, worn at the edges, his grandmother's final gift before she passed. The pages were marked with her favorite verses, each one a guidepost for difficult times. "We'll be careful, Mama," he promised, his voice gentle but firm. His fingers lingered on the gold-embossed cover, drawing strength from the familiar texture. "We've trained for this," Zayden added, his usual reserve softening as he embraced his mother, inhaling the familiar scent of her lavender perfume. "And we'll have each other's backs, like always." He glanced around the living room, taking mental snapshots of home to carry with him. The worn couch where they'd watched Sunday football games, the kitchen table where they'd done homework under their mother's watchful eye. The next morning arrived with a pale dawn that painted the sky in hesitant strokes of pink and gold. The twins loaded their bags into an unmarked bureau vehicle, their new identities securely in place like second skins they would wear until the job was done. As Washington, D.C. faded in the rearview mirror, Zayden reviewed their files one last time, while Zion quietly prayed beside him, his lips moving silently with familiar words of comfort. The highway stretched before them, carrying them toward uncertainty and danger. Hours later, they pulled into Montgomery, Alabama, the city's skyline a mix of modern buildings and historical architecture that hinted at its complex past. Their bureau-provided apartment was small but functional, with basic furniture and a kitchenette that smelled faintly of fresh paint. The walls were thin enough to hear neighbors' muffled conversations, a reminder of how careful they would need to be with their own discussions. As night settled over the city, the brothers sat at their small dining table, case files spread before them like puzzle pieces they needed to arrange, preparing for the challenge ahead. "One more time?" Zayden asked, holding up Judge Whitmore's file, his eyes tired but determined. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but neither brother felt ready to sleep. Zion nodded, reaching for the documents, faith and purpose steadying his hands. The table lamp cast long shadows across their determined faces as they began their final review before bed, two brothers united against a system that had harmed too many for too long. Outside their window, Montgomery slept, unaware that the wheels of change had already been set in motion. The morning sun beat down on Montgomery's old brick town hall as Zayden and Zion adjusted their matching navy blue polos with Community Outreach Initiative embroidered on the chest. They joined the steady stream of people filing into the building for the monthly town meeting, nodding politely at the locals who glanced their way with curious expressions. A few whispers followed them. Outsiders weren't common in this tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business. "Remember," Zayden whispered to his brother, nudging him gently with his elbow. "We're Derek and Marcus Fields from Atlanta. Don't slip up." His voice was barely audible, his lips barely moving as they climbed the worn stone steps. The meeting room was packed, with every folding chair filled and people standing along the walls, fanning themselves with program handouts. The ancient air conditioning unit rattled in the corner, struggling against the summer heat. At the front, Sheriff Clyde Donnelly commanded the podium, his silver badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights like a warning beacon. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he answered questions about recent break-ins, his thick fingers gripping the edges of the wooden stand tight enough to whiten his knuckles. "Now, folks, I assure you we're handling everything," Donnelly drawled, waving off concerns with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Crime rates are down thanks to our proactive measures." He puffed out his chest slightly, scanning the room as if daring anyone to challenge him. The twins exchanged glances at his emphasis on proactive. They'd read about those measures in their case files: targeted stops, questionable arrests, evidence that seemed too convenient. Zayden's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle twitching beneath his skin. Halfway through the meeting, the door creaked open, drawing several heads to turn. A tall black teenager in a Letterman jacket slipped in quietly, trying to find space along the back wall, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself smaller. Sheriff Donnelly's eyes locked onto him immediately, like a predator spotting prey, his previous sentence trailing off mid-word. Well, if it isn't Khalil James." Donnelly's voice cut through the room, silencing a nearby conversation. "Shouldn't you be in school instead of loitering around here?" His tone dripped with accusation, making the innocent question sound like an indictment. The teen stood straighter, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "It's lunch period, sir. I'm here because my mom wanted updates about the neighborhood watch program." His voice cracked slightly with nervousness, but he met the sheriff's gaze. "Sure you are," Donnelly sneered, his lip curling upward. "Just like you were just walking past Miller's Hardware when those tools went missing last week." He made air quotes with his fingers, drawing a few uncomfortable chuckles from his supporters. "I didn't take anything," Khalil protested, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment as several people turned to stare. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead. Whether from the heat or the pressure, it wasn't clear. Deputies Paxton and Lee moved to flank the teen, their boots squeaking against the linoleum floor. Paxton's hand rested meaningfully on his belt, while Lee smirked, positioning himself to block the exit. They moved with practiced coordination, like wolves circling. Zion casually raised his phone, pretending to check messages while actually recording the confrontation. His thumb moved carefully over the screen, making sure the angle captured everything. Beside him, Zayden's keen eyes noted the deputies' badge numbers and name tags, committing them to memory, his expression neutral despite the anger building inside. The room had grown uncomfortably quiet. Several people shifted in their seats, but no one spoke up. An older woman looked down at her lap, shaking her head slightly. The tension hung thick in the air, as stifling as the summer heat. "Maybe we should search you right now," Donnelly continued, clearly enjoying the teen's discomfort. "Since you have such a habit of being in the wrong place." His hand moved toward his belt, a gesture that wasn't quite a threat but wasn't innocent either. Zion stepped forward, smoothly interrupting. "Excuse me, Sheriff. Marcus Fields from Atlanta Outreach. Could I get your card? We'd love to coordinate with local law enforcement on youth programs." His voice was friendly but firm, drawing attention away from the teenager. He extended his hand with a warm smile that masked his true intentions. The distraction worked. Donnelly's attention shifted, though his eyes remained cold, despite his practiced smile that revealed too many teeth. He reluctantly shook Zion's hand, his grip unnecessarily tight. Later, as people filed out, the twins lingered near the courthouse wing, pretending to study a bulletin board covered with faded notices and community announcements. A clerk hurried past, manila folders clutched to her chest, muttering to her colleague, "Another Whitmore special coming up. You know how he and Donnelly work their handshake deals." She glanced nervously over her shoulder, lowering her voice even further. Back in their apartment that evening, Zion carefully uploaded the recorded confrontation through their secure connection. The faint blue light from his laptop illuminated his focused expression as his fingers tapped quietly on the keyboard. Zayden spread out their case files across the kitchen table, comparing incident reports, his finger tracing patterns between similar events. Coffee cups sat forgotten beside them, the liquid long gone cold. "He's not just a dirty sheriff," Zayden said quietly, tapping a document with his pen. "He's protected." The realization settled over them like a heavy blanket. Zion nodded grimly, "And we're in deep already." He glanced at the window, pulling the curtain closed a little tighter. A car passed slowly on the street below, its headlights briefly illuminating their worried faces. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Montgomery County Courthouse as Zayden and Zion Carter walked through the metal detectors. They wore simple button-down shirts and carried notepads, playing their roles as research assistants perfectly. The cool air inside was a welcome relief from the Alabama heat already building outside, the kind of heat that seemed to stick to your skin like a wet blanket. "Welcome, boys," called Miss Loretta Samuels from behind the information desk. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her warm smile brightened the austere lobby. Deep laugh lines framed her kind eyes, suggesting years of fighting to maintain joy in a place that rarely delivered it. A small family photo sat beside her computer, a reminder of the life that existed beyond these cold walls. "Here to observe today's proceedings?" "Yes, ma'am," Zion replied with a gentle smile that reached his eyes. We're studying sentencing patterns for our nonprofit. Miss Loretta nodded knowingly. Well, you'll certainly get an education today. The brothers found seats in the back row of courtroom 3. The wooden benches were hard and uncomfortable, much like the atmosphere that filled the room. People spoke in whispers, their anxiety palpable. Mothers clutched purses to their chests. Fathers checked watches repeatedly. A young woman dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to arrive. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff's voice boomed. All rise. The Honorable Judge Randall Whitmore, presiding. Judge Whitmore swept in, his black robes flowing behind him like dark wings. His face wore a permanent sneer as he surveyed the courtroom like a king viewing his subjects. His cold eyes scanned faces without a hint of compassion, lingering a moment longer on anyone who dared meet his gaze. He didn't so much sit in his chair as he claimed it, spreading his presence across the bench, adjusting his robes with practiced precision, like an actor preparing for a performance he'd given countless times before. The first case made Zayden's stomach turn. Terry Hodge, barely 19, stood alone before the judge. His public defender hadn't shown up. The young man's shoulders hunched forward as if already carrying an invisible weight, his fingers fidgeting nervously with the hem of his shirt. Mr. Hodge, Whitmore drawled, not bothering to hide his disdain, each word dripping with contempt. Caught with marijuana again, I see. Your Honor, my lawyer, Terry started, his voice cracking with nervousness, eyes darting around the courtroom in search of help that wasn't coming. Silence. Whitmore's gavel crashed down, the sound echoing through the hushed room like a gunshot. 20 years. Next case. Zion's pen trembled slightly as he wrote. 20 years for a minor possession charge. No legal representation. No chance to speak. Terry's mother in the gallery stifled a sob, her hand pressed against her mouth to contain her grief, her body folding in on itself as if physically struck. Throughout the morning, they watched Whitmore's performance repeat with slight variations. Black defendants received maximum sentences, their pleas falling on deaf ears. White defendants got minimal penalties or had their cases dismissed entirely with a friendly nod. Public defenders were waved away or mysteriously absent when their clients needed them most. The pattern was as clear as it was disturbing. During a recess, Zion approached Miss Loretta's desk for water. Quite a morning, he said carefully, keeping his voice neutral despite the anger simmering beneath. She glanced around before responding quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Been this way long as I can remember, sugar. Some folks say justice is blind, but round here, she seems to peek through that blindfold quite a bit. She passed him a paper cup, her fingers briefly touching his in silent solidarity. Not much changes in 30 years at this courthouse. Meanwhile, Zayden noticed a pattern. 2 lawyers, Gerald Knapp and Linda Thorne, kept appearing for certain cases. They'd whisper with the bailiff, exchange knowing looks with Whitmore, and their clients would receive surprisingly light sentences. Knapp, a heavyset man with an expensive watch that caught the light whenever he gestured, seemed particularly comfortable, leaning on the bench like he owned it, sharing private jokes with the court clerk. The brothers documented everything, timestamps, case numbers, sentence disparities. The way Whitmore's tone changed depending on who stood before him, the suspicious absence of public defenders, the seemingly choreographed dance between certain private attorneys and court officials. Nothing escaped their trained eyes. Back in their small apartment that evening, Zayden's fingers flew across his encrypted laptop, compiling the day's data. The numbers told a story more damning than they'd expected. Average sentences for black defendants were triple those of white defendants for identical charges. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, too blatant to be anything but intentional. Zion finished encoding their daily report to Diane while shaking his head. The way he treated that young man, Terry. No legal counsel, no chance to speak. His voice trailed off, heavy with the weight of what they'd witnessed. It wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. They're all connected, Zayden muttered, staring at his screen, connecting invisible dots between names and cases. We're not just looking at a crooked judge. This is an operation. His fingers paused over the keyboard as the full scope of what they faced began to take shape. And it's bigger than we thought. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling backyard of the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department. Red checkered tablecloths dotted with paper plates and plastic utensils covered long folding tables arranged in neat rows. The rich, tantalizing smell of barbecue smoke filled the air as Sheriff Donnelly worked the grill with practiced confidence, wearing an apron that read, "Law and Order Chef." His thick fingers flipped burgers with surprising dexterity, while his deputy assistants scurried around setting up more chairs and coolers filled with ice-cold drinks. "Well, if it ain't our Atlanta friends," Donnelly called out as Zayden and Zion approached, his voice booming across the yard. His smile stretched wide, but didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes, which remained as hard as river stones. "Glad you boys could make it to our little get-together." Zion felt a wave of uneasiness wash over him, settling deep in his stomach like a cold stone, but kept his expression pleasant and relaxed. "Thanks for the invitation, Sheriff. Nice spread you've got here." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Donnelly replied, flipping a burger with a theatrical flourish. Grease sizzled on the hot coals, sending up small flames. "Y'all been mighty interested in our little community lately. Thought you should see how we do things proper round here. Southern hospitality and all that." He winked, a gesture that seemed more threatening than friendly. The brothers circulated carefully through the crowd, making small talk with deputies and court clerks who eyed them with poorly disguised suspicion. Conversations would halt momentarily whenever they approached, only to resume in hushed tones after they passed. In a corner near the building, Judge Whitmore held court with a group of attorneys, including Knapp and Thorne. His laugh carried across the yard, sharp and cruel like breaking glass. The men around him nodded eagerly at everything he said, their sycophantic smiles never wavering. "Here you go, fellas." Deputy Rick Paxton appeared suddenly beside them with 2 plastic cups, his smile too wide to be genuine, eyes glinting with something that made Zayden's skin crawl. "Best lemonade in Alabama. Miss Martha's special recipe, secret ingredient and everything." Zayden accepted his cup with a polite nod, his fingers brushing against the condensation on the outside. "Thank you, Deputy. Appreciate it." He caught a whiff of something unusual beneath the sweet lemon scent, but dismissed it as local flavoring. They sipped slowly, maintaining their cover while carefully observing the crowd and making mental notes. Within minutes, Zion's vision began to swim, the faces around him blurring into smudges of color like watercolors left in the rain. He tried to catch Zayden's eye, a warning forming on his lips, but his brother was already swaying slightly, blinking hard as if trying to clear his head, his normally sharp gaze unfocused. "You boys ain't looking so good." Deputy Sawyer Lee's voice seemed to come from far away, echoing strangely in Zion's ears like he was speaking through a tunnel. "Let's get you some air. Heat can be brutal this time of year." His concerned tone didn't match the predatory gleam in his eyes. Zayden fumbled for his phone as they were helped toward a patrol car, strong hands gripping their elbows with unnecessary force. His fingers wouldn't cooperate, feeling thick and useless like they belonged to someone else. The world tilted sideways as he slumped against his brother's shoulder. The last thing he saw was Sheriff Donnelly's satisfied smirk before darkness swallowed him whole. The twins woke to cold concrete pressing against their cheeks and the harsh clang of metal reverberating through their skulls. Their heads pounded relentlessly, like drums beating in perfect, painful rhythm, as they found themselves in a dimly lit holding cell with peeling paint and the smell of bleach and despair. Their phones, wallets, and all personal belongings had vanished, leaving them vulnerable and disconnected from the outside world. Deputy Paxton's face appeared at the bars, half hidden in shadow, his features twisted with malicious pleasure. "Welcome to Montgomery County Jail, boys, or should I say, Agents Carter?" His sneer was visible even in the poor light, teeth gleaming like those of a predator. "Thought you were real slick, didn't you? Poking around where you don't belong like nobody would notice?" "Y'all made a big mistake coming here," Deputy Lee added from beside him, tapping his nightstick against the bars rhythmically, each metallic clang sending spikes of pain through the twins' already throbbing heads. Nobody knows you're here, not your bosses, not your friends, and that's exactly how it's gonna stay. Zion closed his eyes, trying to pray through the thick fog in his mind, searching for the comfort his grandmother had always promised would be there in his darkest hour. Beside him, Zayden whispered hoarsely, his voice cracking with dehydration. "No one knows we're here. They buried us alive." The harsh fluorescent lights flickered on at 6 a.m. as heavy boots stomped down the jail corridor. A guard's baton crashed against the metal bars, making Zayden and Zion jump awake on their thin mattresses. The jarring sound echoed through the cell block, leaving a ringing in their ears that seemed to penetrate their very bones. "Rise and shine, troublemakers." The guard threw 2 orange jumpsuits through the bars, his face twisted with disdain. "Arraignment in 30. Get dressed." Zayden rubbed his eyes, still groggy from whatever they'd been drugged with. His head pounded like a drum, and his mouth felt like cotton that had been left in the desert for days. The lingering effects of the unknown substance made his limbs feel heavy, as if they were moving through thick mud. "We need to call our—" "No calls, no lawyers, no talking," the guard snapped, tightening his grip on the baton threateningly. "Judge's orders." His eyes glinted with a cruel satisfaction as he watched their faces fall. He tapped his baton against his palm, a silent reminder of what would happen if they pushed back. The twins exchanged worried glances as they changed into the scratchy orange uniforms that smelled of cheap detergent and desperation. Their wrists and ankles were shackled with heavy chains that clinked with each step, the cold metal biting into their skin like tiny teeth. Every movement was restricted, a constant reminder that their freedom had been stripped away. The Montgomery County courtroom was packed when they entered. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of curious onlookers who whispered and pointed as the twins shuffled in. Some faces showed open hostility, others morbid curiosity. At the defense table sat Charles Renner, their court-appointed lawyer, absently flipping through a thin case file that couldn't have been more than a few pages. His wrinkled suit and bloodshot eyes suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, and the faint smell of whiskey clung to him like cologne. He didn't even look up when they approached, just kept flipping pages as if reading a boring magazine. "Your Honor," Zayden started as they approached, desperate to explain. "We're federal—" The bailiff's hand clamped down on his shoulder with bruising force. "Quiet until spoken to," he growled, pushing Zayden forward with enough strength to make him stumble. The chains rattled loudly in the hushed courtroom. Judge Whitmore's lips curled into a smirk as he adjusted his black robes, settling into his high-backed chair like a king on his throne. His cold eyes swept over the twins with undisguised contempt. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines of cruelty etched around his mouth. "Well, well, our visiting researchers seem to have gotten themselves into quite a predicament." "Your Honor, please," Zion tried, his voice steady despite his fear. "If you just contact the FBI—" "Silence!" Whitmore's gavel crashed down with unnecessary force, the sound reverberating through the courtroom like a gunshot. Several people in the gallery flinched. "These defendants are charged with identity theft, impersonating federal officers, and conspiracy to interfere with the administration of justice. How do you plead?" Renner stood slowly, not even looking at his clients, his movements sluggish and disinterested. A coffee stain marked the front of his tie, and his collar was frayed at the edges. "Not guilty, Your Honor." He sat back down immediately, making no further argument, not even bothering to request bail or question the charges. "Very well. Trial is set for Thursday morning." Whitmore's eyes gleamed with malice as he stared directly at the twins. "Until then, defendants are remanded without bail." His smile widened slightly, as if savoring their predicament. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that still carried to every corner of the room. "We don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and causing trouble." Whispers rippled through the gallery like wind through tall grass. An elderly woman near the front row caught Zion's attention. Miss Loretta, her kind face creased with concern, her hands clutching a worn Bible whose pages were yellowed with age and use. A small silver cross pendant hung from her neck, catching the light as she leaned forward. As the bailiff led them past, Zion locked eyes with her and mouthed silently, "We're innocent." She gave an almost imperceptible nod in response, a tiny flicker of hope in this darkening nightmare. Back in their cell, the brothers sat in defeated silence. The gravity of their situation weighed heavily in the stale air between them. The distant sound of doors slamming and inmates shouting only emphasized their isolation in this corrupt system. A single beam of sunlight struggled through the tiny barred window, casting grid-like shadows across the concrete floor. "We have 2 days to hope someone notices we're missing," Zayden said quietly, tracing patterns in the dust on the floor with his finger. His normally confident voice now carried the weight of uncertainty. Zion closed his eyes, his lips moving in a whispered prayer. "God, send someone. Please, we can't fight this alone." His words hung in the air, a desperate plea against the crushing weight of injustice that threatened to bury them both. In the silence that followed, the brothers' shared fear was palpable, but beneath it ran a current of determination that wouldn't be easily extinguished. Miss Loretta's hands trembled slightly as she set her old copper kettle on the stove. The afternoon sun streamed through her kitchen window, but she couldn't shake the chill from what she'd witnessed in court that morning. Those 2 young men, they weren't like the usual defendants she saw parade through Judge Whitmore's courtroom. There was something different about them, something that stirred her conscience deep within. "Something's not right about this whole thing," she muttered, pulling her favorite chamomile tea from the cupboard. Her small kitchen, with its worn linoleum floor and faded yellow curtains, had always been her thinking spot. The familiar surroundings usually brought her comfort, but today her thoughts were too troubled, swirling like storm clouds that refused to dissipate. She remembered how the twins had sat quietly in the back row last week, taking notes and speaking politely to everyone. They'd even helped Mrs. Jenkins pick up her dropped papers when the elderly clerk had fumbled her files. Not the actions of hardened criminals, not by a long shot. They had shown kindness where others might have ignored an old woman's struggle. After 3 unsuccessful phone calls to former courthouse colleagues, each one making excuses or changing the subject when she mentioned the Carter case, Miss Loretta straightened her navy cardigan and grabbed her volunteer ID badge. "Well, if nobody else will look into this, I suppose I'll have to do it myself." Her voice was soft but determined, the same tone she'd used during her 40 years as a schoolteacher when faced with an injustice that needed correcting. The courthouse was quiet at night, just a few cleaning staff making their rounds, the hum of vacuum cleaners echoing through the marble hallways. Miss Loretta nodded to security. They were used to seeing her work late, organizing files and tidying the welcome desk. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was on a mission that made her heart flutter with both fear and purpose. In the clerk's office, her fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard. 20 years of volunteering meant she knew every system password by heart. The docket notes from the arraignment appeared on screen, and she carefully printed them, tucking the papers into her worn leather handbag, her heart pounding with each sheet that emerged from the printer. The risk she was taking wasn't lost on her, but neither was the importance. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, discovering that Charles Renner, their appointed defender, had handled nearly every drug case that crossed Judge Whitmore's bench. The pattern was too neat to be coincidence. In fact, it seemed downright suspicious how quickly these cases moved through the system, always with the same predictable outcomes. It was like watching a play where everyone knew their lines before the script was even written. Her heart picked up speed as she accessed the jail's processing system. The twins' intake photos showed their confusion and fear, so different from their confident demeanor just days ago. She studied their faces, remembering how Zion had caught her eye in court, desperately mouthing those words, "We're innocent." The sincerity in his eyes had haunted her ever since, following her into her dreams and waking her with a sense of urgent responsibility. Back home, Miss Loretta walked slowly to her bedroom closet. Behind carefully folded sweaters lay an old photo album, its leather cover cracked with age. Her fingers found what she was looking for, a graduation picture from her teaching days. In it, a young black man stood proud in his cap and gown, his arm around her shoulders. Hank Morrison had been her brightest student, now a renowned civil rights attorney who took on cases others deemed hopeless. His smile in the photo reminded her of better days, of possibilities. "Lord, let him still believe in justice," she whispered, holding the photo close to her heart. "And give me the courage to do what's right, no matter what it costs." Her prayer hung in the quiet room as she reached for the phone, knowing that tomorrow would bring changes she couldn't yet imagine. The courthouse buzzed with excitement that morning. Local reporters clutched their notepads, whispering about the supposed drug kingpins from Atlanta. Camera phones peeked out despite the no recording signs plastered on every wall. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of the packed audience, their faces a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Outside, a small crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps, drawn by rumors of a high-profile case that had spread through Millfield like wildfire. When the bailiffs brought in Zayden and Zion, their bright orange jumpsuits seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights. The heavy chains around their ankles clinked with each labored step, announcing their arrival like a morbid bell. Metal cuffs bit into their wrists, leaving angry red marks on their skin. Zayden's face remained stoic, jaw clenched tight, while Zion's eyes carefully scanned the crowd, landing briefly on Miss Loretta's worried expression in the third row. She gave him the smallest nod of encouragement. Judge Whitmore's entrance brought immediate silence, as if someone had sucked all the air from the room. His black robe swished dramatically as he settled into his high-backed chair, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his thin mouth. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses with deliberate slowness, savoring his moment of complete control. "Well, well, our Atlanta visitors are ready for their big day," he announced, his voice dripping with mock hospitality. As Assistant DA Meredith Keene began her opening statement about drug trafficking and false identities, her words painting the twins as hardened criminals, Zion suddenly stood up. The chains rattled loudly against the wooden floor, drawing every eye in the room. "Your Honor, we are Federal Bureau of Investigation agents on assignment. There's been a terrible mistake," he declared, his voice steady despite the circumstances. The courtroom froze. Even Whitmore's smirk faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing to suspicious slits. Just then, a man in a crisp navy suit hurried through the double doors, clutching a thick manila envelope to his chest. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he made his way down the center aisle. "Your Honor, I'm here from FBI Records Division in Washington. There was a clerical delay with the verification documents," he announced, slightly out of breath. The envelope made its way to Whitmore's bench through the hands of a bewildered bailiff. He opened it slowly, deliberately, reading through the papers with exaggerated care. His fingers lingered on each page, flipping through them with theatrical skepticism. The twins watched, hearts pounding against their ribs, as their real identities were confirmed in black and white, official government letterhead clear as day. But instead of showing concern, Whitmore threw back his head and laughed. The sound echoed off the high ceiling like thunder, making several people jump in their seats. "Now this," he wheezed, wiping his eyes as if they watered from amusement. "This is creative. Cute story, boys. You expect me to believe you were here to save us from ourselves? That you're some kind of heroes in disguise?" "The documents are authentic, Your Honor," the DC officer insisted, his face flushing with professional indignation. He stepped forward, pointing to the official seals and signatures. "I can verify these myself. I flew in specifically to—" "Oh, I'm sure they look very authentic," Whitmore sneered, tossing the papers aside carelessly. They scattered across his bench like fallen leaves. "Ms. Keene, please continue with the evidence." What followed was a parade of clearly fabricated evidence, security footage edited to show the twins dealing drugs in shadowy corners, witness statements that contradicted known facts and timelines, even planted evidence from their apartment shown in plastic bags. The timestamps on the footage jumped erratically, faces were blurred beyond recognition, and the twins could see their own confusion mirrored in the jurors' furrowed brows. Through it all, Public Defender Renner sat slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon, occasionally muttering "objection" without even looking up, his voice barely audible. Not once did he stand to properly challenge the prosecutor's claims. When Whitmore declared them guilty, the words fell like lead in the silent courtroom. "Life in prison," he announced with obvious pleasure, almost savoring each syllable. without possibility of parole. He banged his gavel with unnecessary force, the sound cracking through the stunned silence. Miss Loretta's gasp was audible above the stunned silence. She clutched her purse so tight her knuckles went white as bone. A tear slipped down her weathered cheek as she shook her head in disbelief. The rest of the audience sat frozen, fear visible on every face, no one daring to speak out against the obvious injustice. A few exchanged worried glances, but quickly looked away when Whitmore's cold gaze swept the room. As deputies moved to escort the twins out, Whitmore called after them with a final barb. "Poetic justice. You boys came looking for dirt. Now you're buried in it." His laughter followed them all the way to the door, a sound that would haunt their dreams for many nights to come. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Miss Loretta made her way down the stark detention center corridor. Her sensible shoes clicked against the cold concrete floor, each step echoing in the emptiness. The guard at the desk barely looked up as she presented her volunteer badge, his weathered face expressionless as he scanned it. Deep lines etched around his mouth suggested years of maintaining the same stern expression. His voice was gruff when he warned, "10 minutes, ma'am. Not a second more." Through the scratched plexiglass partition, she first saw Zion. His usually bright eyes were weary, dark circles beneath them telling of sleepless nights, but they still held that same gentle determination she'd noticed in court. When Zayden joined him moments later, the twins sat shoulder to shoulder, their orange jumpsuits a harsh contrast to their dignified bearing. Their posture remained straight, refusing to be broken by their surroundings. Despite everything, they carried themselves with the quiet strength she'd come to admire. "My boys," Loretta said softly into the phone receiver, her voice warm with maternal concern. Her fingers trembled slightly against the plastic. The worry lines around her eyes deepened. "I knew something wasn't right about all this. I could feel it in my bones. The moment I saw you both in that courtroom, I just knew." "Miss Loretta," Zion's voice crackled through the receiver, "you're the only light we've seen in days." His words made her chest tight with emotion. A small smile flickered across his tired face, a glimpse of his usual warmth. "Just seeing you sitting there in court gave us hope." Zayden leaned closer to the shared phone, his expression more guarded than his brother's. "We shouldn't have been so careless at that BBQ. They were watching us the whole time. We let our guard down." His jaw tightened, the frustration evident in the tension around his eyes. "Now don't you go blaming yourselves," Loretta chided gently, shaking her head. Her silver curls caught the harsh overhead light. "What's done is done. Looking backward won't move us forward. Is there anyone I can contact? Someone who knows the truth about who you are?" Zayden hesitated before speaking, his eyes darting briefly to the guard standing nearby. "There's one person, K.D. Cross, but be careful how you reach out. Very careful." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, the warning clear in his tone. Loretta shook her head slightly, a knowing look crossing her face. "I might have someone better in mind, someone who helped shape who I am today. He owes me a favor, a big one." Her aged fingers gripped the phone tighter, knuckles whitening with determination. "Don't you lose heart in here. Hope doesn't die in the dark. That's something my grandmother always told me, and she never once steered me wrong." The guard's voice cut through their conversation like a knife. 2 minutes? He tapped his watch impatiently, his boots scuffing against the floor. Loretta stood slowly, her joints protesting the movement with audible creaks. She pressed her weathered palm against the cold plexiglass. On the other side, both brothers placed their hands to match hers, creating a moment of connection despite the barrier between them. No words were needed in that silent promise. Their eyes said everything their voices couldn't. Later that evening, in her small but tidy living room, Loretta pulled out an old teacher's scrapbook. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and fragrant with memory. A cup of chamomile tea steamed beside her on the side table as she carefully turned each delicate page. Her fingers traced over decades of smiling faces and achievement certificates until they found what she was looking for, a yellowed envelope labeled Morrison Hank Law School Scholarship. A sad smile crossed her face as she whispered, "You owe me one, Hank. And now it's time to collect." She reached for her phone, determination hardening her gentle features. Miss Loretta's weathered hands shook as she dialed the number from the alumni newsletter. The old rotary phone clicked with each turn, its familiar sound somehow comforting in the quiet of her kitchen. Morning sunlight streamed through her lace curtains as she waited, heart pounding. The aroma of fresh coffee lingered in the air, a small comfort on this troubling morning. "Morrison Law Group," a deep voice answered after 2 rings. "Hank, this is Miss Loretta Samuels." There was a pause, then warmth flooded his tone. "Miss Loretta? My goodness, it's been too long. How are you?" "Not well, dear. I need your help with something terrible." She settled into her worn armchair, clutching the receiver tight. The faded floral pattern had witnessed countless conversations, but none so urgent as this. 2 young men were sentenced to life yesterday. They're FBI agents, Hank. They proved it right there in court with official papers, but Judge Whitmore, her voice cracked. He laughed at them, laughed and sentenced them anyway. "Wait, Judge Randall Whitmore?" The warmth in Hank's voice turned to steel. "Miss Loretta, are you absolutely certain about this?" "I watched it with my own eyes, child. Been volunteering at that courthouse 15 years. Never seen anything like it." She described the twins, their dignity even in chains, the mockery of justice she'd witnessed. Her free hand trembled as she recounted the details. The sound of typing came through the line. "I'm looking up recent cases now," Hank said. "Good Lord, these sentencing patterns are completely outside statistical norms. Miss Loretta, you taught me that justice matters more than convenience. I'll be there tonight." "You're coming yourself." Relief flooded her voice, washing away some of the helplessness that had been crushing her spirit since yesterday. "Already packing my briefcase." More typing. "Sarah, get me emergency filing templates for federal intervention." His voice returned to the phone. "Which bus station should I come to?" "The Greyhound on Madison. I'll pick you up myself." "Miss Loretta?" His voice softened. "Thank you for calling. Some debts can never be repaid, but helping the teacher who believed in me? That's a start." Hours later, as evening settled over Montgomery, Loretta stood at the bus station. The neon lights buzzed overhead, casting a glow on the faces of weary travelers. When Hank stepped down, she hardly recognized the lanky boy she'd taught in the tall, distinguished man before her. But his eyes still held that same fire for justice she'd noticed decades ago. He wrapped her in a warm hug, then pulled back, briefcase firm in his grip. "Let's bring them home," he said quietly, but with unmistakable determination. Loretta nodded, wiping away tears as they walked to her car together. For the first time since watching those boys being led away in chains, she felt something bloom in her chest: hope. The transport van's metal floor vibrated beneath Zayden's feet as it rumbled down the highway. Through the tiny mesh-covered window, he caught glimpses of a clear Alabama morning, but his heart felt heavy as lead. In the van behind them, he knew Zion was making the same journey, probably praying under his breath like he always did in tough times. It was their way of coping, Zayden with analysis, Zion with faith. The Montgomery Correctional Facility loomed ahead, a sprawling complex of concrete and razor wire that seemed to stretch forever against the blue sky. The van passed through 2 security checkpoints before stopping in a covered intake area where guards with stern faces and cold eyes waited. As Zayden stepped out, legs stiff from the 3-hour ride, he saw Zion being led from the other van. Their eyes met briefly, and they exchanged a subtle nod, their childhood signal for stay strong. It was all they had now. "Keep moving, FBI boy," a guard sneered, pushing Zayden forward with unnecessary force. "Your badge don't mean nothing in here." The twins were separated, each led through different doors for processing. The intake procedure was deliberately humiliating. Strip search, delousing spray that stung his skin, an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, and mugshots where they barked at him not to smile. Zayden's FBI training hadn't prepared him for this level of dehumanization. In Unit C, a guard shoved Zayden toward Cell 218, his new home for who knew how long. Inside, a young black man sat on the bottom bunk, hunched over what looked like a magazine with tattered edges. He glanced up nervously, his eyes darting between Zayden and the closing cell door. "I'm Zayden," he said quietly, trying to appear non-threatening. "Rashawn," the young man replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're one of them FBI agents everyone's talking about? Word travels fast in here." Zayden nodded, climbing onto the top bunk that creaked under his weight. Over the next hour, Rashawn gradually opened up, his initial wariness melting away. He'd been caught stealing food from a convenience store, his first offense, but Judge Whitmore had given him 5 years without blinking an eye. "I just wanted to write poetry," Rashawn admitted, showing Zayden a notebook filled with cramped handwriting. "But I can barely read, never got much schooling. Foster care ain't big on education." Meanwhile, in Unit D, Zion was putting his natural ability to connect with people to good use. During intake processing, he'd mentioned his college degree, and the education coordinator, a tired-looking woman with hopeful eyes, had immediately recruited him for the GED program. "We're short on tutors," she'd explained, handing him a stack of workbooks. "Most inmates who could teach don't want to. They say there's no point." That evening, Zion attended a chapel meeting led by Brother Elijah, an elderly chaplain with kind eyes, weathered skin, and a gentle demeanor that seemed out of place in the harsh prison environment. After the service, Brother Elijah approached him, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. "We could use a fresh voice next Sunday," he suggested with a warm smile. "Would you share your testimony? These men need to hear from someone who understands their struggles." Back in their respective cells that night, both brothers lay awake on thin mattresses. Zion closed his eyes in prayer, asking for strength and guidance, his whispered words a comfort in the darkness. Across the prison complex, Zayden composed mental letters to their handler, analyzing every detail of their situation and planning their next moves. In the darkness of their separate cells, both brothers whispered the same word: hope. It was all they had left, but sometimes hope was enough. The courthouse steps gleamed in the early morning sun as Hank Morrison adjusted his tie and briefcase. Miss Loretta walked beside him, her sensible shoes clicking against the marble. At the front desk, Hank's credentials earned them quick access, though the clerk's eyes narrowed at their request for Judge Whitmore's case files. "Public records," Hank said firmly, sliding the formal request across the counter. "Alabama Code Section 361240. I'll wait." He maintained steady eye contact with the clerk, who shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. They settled into a small research room surrounded by towering shelves of leather-bound books and the musty smell of old paper. Hank worked methodically, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he cross-referenced cases. Miss Loretta took careful notes, her neat handwriting filling page after page. The only sounds were the scratching of her pen and the occasional rustle of paper as Hank turned another page. "Look at this," Hank muttered, spreading out 3 files. Same charge, same circumstances. White defendant, probation. Black defendant, maximum sentence. Every time. His finger tapped the sentencing dates, each one a nail in the coffin of justice. The pattern emerged like a dark tapestry, case after case showing stark disparities. More disturbing were the connections between law firms. The same names kept appearing: Knapp and Associates, Thorne Legal Group, all with financial ties to both Donnelly and Whitmore. Campaign donations, charity event sponsorships, property investments, a web of money binding them together. A young paralegal, Angela Woodson, brought them another stack of files. Her hands trembled slightly as she leaned close. "Be careful what you're looking for," she whispered. "Some things aren't meant to be found." Her eyes darted toward the door before she hurried away. Around noon, the janitor, an elderly man with kind eyes, shuffled in to empty the trash. As he passed Hank's desk, a sealed manila envelope slipped from his cart. Inside were internal memos, each bearing Whitmore's distinctive scrawl in the margins. A just outcome per arrangement, and standard treatment for these people. Hank's heart pounded as he carefully photographed each document with his phone. Miss Loretta's discovery proved even more damning. A comprehensive list of every defendant who'd stood before Whitmore in the past 5 years. The racial disparity was impossible to ignore. She showed Hank her calculations, the numbers so lopsided they seemed almost unreal. Hank stepped into the hallway, phone pressed to his ear. "Sarah, I need background checks on every name I'm about to send you. Focus on the public defender assignments. A Charles Renner keeps showing up." He lowered his voice. "And check property records too. I think there's money changing hands somewhere." Back in the research room, Angela returned with coffee. Her voice was barely audible. "There's more. But some records, they've disappeared, expunged without proper procedure." She slid a sticky note with her phone number across the table. "Call me after hours." The afternoon light was fading when Hank and Loretta finally gathered their evidence. Walking out into the warm Alabama sun, Hank's expression was grim. "This isn't just one bad ruling, it's a network." Loretta clutched her notebook close. "Then we pull the thread until the whole thing unravels." Determination hardened her gentle features as she added, "Every last bit of it." The morning sun barely touched the courthouse windows when Hank Morrison strode through the front doors, a thick manila envelope tucked under his arm. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floor as he approached the clerk's window to file the motion to appeal. The document was meticulous, pages of evidence, precedents, and constitutional violations carefully laid out, each one a potential key to unlock the twins' freedom. Within 3 hours, his office phone rang. Judge Henry Mathers had denied the motion without even a hearing. Hank's jaw tightened as he read the dismissal, noting how Mathers had barely addressed any of the points raised, instead offering vague procedural reasons for the rejection. "They're circling the wagons," he told Miss Loretta over coffee at her kitchen table. "Every judge in this circuit is connected to Whitmore somehow. They're protecting their own. We need to aim higher, maybe federal court." Loretta nodded, her fingers wrapped around her teacup, determination hardening in her eyes. "Then we'll make more noise. My ladies' prayer circle meets tonight. These women have connections all over town. Teachers, nurses, secretaries to important men. They hear things." That afternoon, Hank met with Darnell Hughes at his community center. The civil rights leader listened intently, taking detailed notes, his expression growing darker with each new detail. "2 FBI agents railroaded by our own system?" Hughes shook his head. "This is exactly the kind of case we need to spotlight. I've got contacts at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference who need to hear about this." Meanwhile, Loretta's church group sprang into action. The sound of an old printing press filled the church basement as they produced stacks of flyers detailing the corruption. The women worked with quiet efficiency, their faces set with purpose. "Be careful who you give these to," Loretta warned, passing out bundles. "Some folks might not want this truth getting out. Some might even report back to Whitmore." A message arrived from the prison chaplain. Zion had asked him to tell Loretta to keep the faith. The simple note gave her renewed energy as she coordinated with her network of church ladies, who began quietly distributing information throughout their neighborhoods, slipping flyers into friendly hands after Sunday service. Hank's federal filing mentioned Diane Keller by name, hoping to force the FBI's hand in acknowledging their agents. But the pushback was swift. A local judge cornered him in the courthouse parking lot, stepping from between 2 cars as Hank was leaving for the day. "Morrison," the judge said, his voice low and threatening, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "You're making powerful enemies. Think about your career. Cases like this can follow a man for decades." That evening, Loretta stood before her congregation, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The pews were packed with concerned faces, many holding the flyers they'd helped distribute, others nodding along as she spoke. "2 innocent boys are in chains," she declared, gripping the pulpit, her voice rising with conviction. "But we have the power to lift our voices until the world hears them, until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." The congregation murmured in agreement, and several amens echoed through the church. They understood what was at stake, not just 2 young men's freedom, but the very integrity of their justice system and the community they all called home. The prison chapel was quiet except for Zion's clear voice rising above the wooden pews. Sunlight filtered through barred windows, casting long shadows across the faces of 24 inmates seated in rough rows. Zion stood tall at the simple podium, his orange jumpsuit bright against the dull gray walls. "Sometimes our darkest moments become our greatest testimony," Zion said, his words carrying to the back where Zayden sat watching. "We may be confined by these walls, but our spirits remain free." Several inmates nodded, their expressions softening. In the front row, an elderly man wiped his eyes with weathered hands. Brother Elijah, the regular chaplain, smiled gently from his seat near the door, clearly moved by Zion's natural ability to connect with the men. After the service, inmates gathered around Zion, sharing their struggles and asking for prayer. He listened with genuine care, placing a reassuring hand on shoulders, speaking words of hope. One young man confessed through tears that he hadn't heard from his family in months. Zion embraced him, promising to pray for reconciliation. Later that afternoon, Officer Mendez approached Zion in the common area. The guard's kind eyes darted around before he slipped a folded paper into Zion's hand during the routine pat-down. "Legal mail," he whispered. His fingers trembled slightly, revealing his own fear of being caught helping. In his cell that evening, Zion carefully unfolded Miss Loretta's note. Her elegant handwriting brought comfort. "Hank is here. We're fighting. Don't give up." Below was a scripture about endurance through trials. He pressed the paper to his chest, feeling less alone. The faint scent of her perfume lingered on the page, a small reminder of the world beyond concrete and steel. Meanwhile, Zayden sat with Rashawn and his brother Terrell in the prison library. The younger Lee brother radiated anger, his jaw clenched tight as Zayden tried to engage him in conversation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on their faces. "System's rigged," Tyrell spat. "What's the point of trying?" "The point is proving them wrong," Rashawn said quietly, sliding a piece of paper across the table. "I wrote something, Zayden, about finding strength even here." Zayden read the poem titled "Caged Doesn't Mean Broken." The words were raw but powerful, speaking of resilience and dignity behind bars. He looked up to see Terrell reading over his shoulder, his hard expression softening slightly. For the first time, Zayden glimpsed a flicker of hope in the young man's eyes. During recreation time, the twins began gathering stories from other inmates. Dates, details, patterns of injustice. They wove this information into seemingly innocent letters, using a code they'd developed during FBI training. Each day brought new evidence of the corruption that had brought them here. Their cell walls became an invisible map of connections, stored safely in their trained memories. That night, lying on his thin mattress, Zion held Loretta's note close. The paper was already worn from multiple readings, but the message remained clear. Hope was still alive, working through faithful hands beyond these walls. Outside his window, a single star peeked through the bars, reminding him that some lights couldn't be extinguished by darkness. The morning sun cast long shadows as Hank Morrison climbed the worn steps of a small house on the outskirts of Montgomery. Paint peeled from the wooden railings, but bright flowers lined the walkway, defiant splashes of color against the weathered exterior. This was his 5th interview today, and his notebook was already filled with similar stories of injustice. Clarence Turner opened the door slowly, his military bearing still evident despite the slight tremor in his hands. The lines on his face told of hardship, but his eyes remained clear and determined. "Mr. Morrison? Come in, sir." The living room was modest but immaculate, with framed service medals on one wall and family photos on another. A small American flag stood in a corner, dustless and properly folded. 20 years, Clarence said, pulling out a cardboard box stuffed with yellowed papers. He handled them with reverence, as if each document represented a day lost. "That's what Whitmore gave me for a taillight violation that turned into a drug charge. Drugs that weren't even mine." His voice was steady, but pain flickered across his weathered face. "Officer claimed he found them under the passenger seat. Never even let me see what he supposedly found." Hank carefully examined each document while Clarence spoke, making notes and occasionally nodding. The pattern was familiar now. Traffic stop, escalated search, evidence appearing from nowhere, harsh sentence. The veteran had meticulously documented everything, dates and times recorded with military precision. My wife couldn't handle it, Clarence continued, his fingers tracing the edge of a faded photograph of a smiling woman. Lost the house, lost my pension. By the time I won appeal 12 years later, there wasn't much left to come home to. He handed Hank a thick manila envelope, carefully sealed with tape. These are copies of everything: court transcripts, evidence logs, even notes from my public defender. Take them. Maybe they'll help those boys you mentioned. Lord knows nobody helped me when I needed it. Across town, Miss Loretta stood before another church congregation, her voice strong despite her age. The afternoon light streamed through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the attentive faces. Two young men came to shine light on corruption, and now they sit in darkness. But God sees them, and we must be their voice. She gripped the podium tightly, her passion evident in every word. This community knows injustice all too well. It's time we stand together. In her cubicle at the courthouse, Angela Woodson carefully photocopied case files during her lunch break. Her hands shook slightly. She knew the risk. Each unauthorized copy could cost her the job she'd held for 15 years, but each summary showed the same disturbing pattern: black defendants, minor charges, maximum sentences. She slipped the papers into her purse beneath her sandwich container and quietly returned to her desk. Later that afternoon, Hank met with Jasmine Cole, a young reporter from an independent news site, in a quiet coffee shop. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the quiet hum of conversation as her eyes widened reviewing his findings. The private prison connection is key, she said, pointing to financial records with a manicured fingernail. Judge Whitmore's investment firm owns shares in 3 correctional facilities. Every harsh sentence fills their beds. She lowered her voice. My editor's nervous about running this, but I'm not backing down. People need to know. Back in his temporary office, Hank organized the mounting evidence. The late afternoon sun slanted through dusty blinds as he created separate files for each victim of Whitmore's corruption. Clarence's military precision had revealed new layers: altered dates, missing signatures, procedural violations that couldn't be coincidence. The federal petition was taking shape, built on decades of systematic abuse, each page another nail in Whitmore's judicial coffin. Loretta brought him coffee in a chipped mug, studying the stacks of files that now covered every surface. Her eyes misted as she took in the sheer volume of injustice. How many lives has he ruined? Too many, Hank replied, adding another exhibit to the growing report. He rubbed his tired eyes but straightened with renewed determination. But maybe now we can stop him from ruining more. The morning light filtered through Hank's office blinds as his phone buzzed. Jasmine Cole's name flashed on the screen. It's ready, she said, her voice tight with anticipation. The story goes live at 6 tonight. I've got documents, data, and direct quotes from multiple sources. This one's bulletproof. Hank leaned back in his chair, heart racing. Any pushback from your editors? I run my own site, remember? That's why I can publish this. The mainstream papers are too scared of Whitmore and Donnelly. They've crushed reporters before, but they can't touch me. By nightfall, Jasmine's article spread like wildfire across social media. Her careful research laid bare the ugly truth. Judge Whitmore's courtroom had been systematically destroying Black lives for years. The twins' case was just the latest example in a long pattern of judicial abuse that stretched back decades. At the hastily organized press conference in the Pine Street Community Center, Miss Loretta stood tall despite her years. Camera phones recorded as she spoke, her voice clear and strong. I've sat in that courthouse for decades watching justice bend and break, but when those boys were sentenced, FBI agents doing their job, something in me couldn't stay quiet anymore. Not one more child, not one more family torn apart by this corruption. The crowd murmured in agreement. Local pastors nodded solemnly. Community activists took notes furiously. Hank watched from the side, ready to handle the legal questions, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. My daddy taught me that silence helps the oppressor, Loretta continued, gripping the podium until her knuckles whitened. Well, I'm not being silent anymore. Those boys are innocent, And they're not the only ones Whitmore has wronged. There are hundreds more, hundreds of our children. Sheriff Donnelly's response came within hours, a blustering threat of legal action against Jasmine. But she stood firm, backed by documentation and witness statements. Her article had already been shared thousands of times, reaching far beyond their small community. "Let him sue," Hank told reporters, his eyes flashing with determination. "Discovery works both ways. We welcome the chance to put everything on record." He outlined their plans to take the case federal, describing the pattern of abuse they'd uncovered in meticulous detail. The community center buzzed with energy as people shared stories, signed petitions, and organized protest plans. Ministers offered prayers that echoed against the walls. College students set up social media campaigns right there on their laptops. Elderly residents who remembered segregation wiped away tears, seeing the fight for justice continue in a new generation. Loretta's final words at the podium captured the mood perfectly. "These walls of injustice might be tall, but they're not stronger than truth. And truth has a way of being heard, even in the darkest places." As the event wound down, Loretta watched the crowd sharing contact information and making plans. Some were crying softly, others wore expressions of fierce determination. Hank squeezed her shoulder supportively, both of them knowing this was just the beginning of their fight. But for the first time, they weren't fighting alone. The fluorescent lights dimmed in Unit D as evening settled over Montgomery Correctional. Zion sat cross-legged on his lower bunk, surrounded by a small circle of inmates who spoke in hushed tones. Their faces were tired but attentive, drawn to his quiet strength. "Judge Whitmore gave me 15 years for a broken taillight and what he called suspicious behavior," whispered Marcus Jenkins, a gray-haired man in his 50s. "Found an old hunting knife in my glove box, called it a deadly weapon." Across the room, Zayden carefully wrote in his composition notebook, disguising the documentation as personal journaling. His cellmate Rashawn kept watch near the door, while his younger brother Terrell sat nearby, anger and pain etched on his young face. "My story's similar," said Leonard Foster, known as Lenny to the others. His voice was low, but clear. "But there's more. Before I got locked up, I worked in prison administration. Saw things I wasn't supposed to see." He glanced around nervously before continuing. "There were these donation records, big money coming in from private companies, always right after Whitmore handed down certain sentences." Zion leaned forward. "What kind of companies?" "Prison management firms, security contractors, even some construction businesses." Lenny's hands trembled slightly. "The paperwork would come through late at night. I was working overtime, filing records. Nobody thought I was paying attention." Officer Mendez passed by their unit, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He made eye contact with Zion briefly, giving an almost imperceptible nod before moving on. He was one of the few guards who treated them with basic dignity. "My mama always said the truth comes out in circles," Rashawn said softly, returning to his spot in the group. "Like ripples in water. Can't stop 'em once they start." Tyrell, usually angry and withdrawn, spoke up. "Y'all really FBI? For real?" When Zion nodded, the young man's eyes widened. "Then you gotta tell them what's happening in here. About all of us." Zayden's pen moved steadily across the paper, recording each story, each detail, each pattern of injustice. The stories poured out. Fathers separated from children, students forced to abandon college dreams, workers who lost everything over minor infractions or false charges. As lights out approached, the group dispersed quietly. Zion carefully tucked his notebook beneath his thin mattress, making sure it lay flat and unnoticeable. He caught Zayden's eye across the darkening room and whispered, "One day they'll read our story and know the truth." The room fell silent, but the weight of their shared experiences lingered in the air. Each man returned to his bunk, carrying the hope that their voices would one day be heard. The fight for justice was far from over, but together, they found strength in their unity. Hank Morrison stood in the federal courthouse lobby, his arms laden with 3 heavy boxes of documents. Each was meticulously organized: financial records, court transcripts, witness statements, and most importantly, verification of Zayden and Zion's FBI credentials. The security guard raised an eyebrow at the volume but waved him through after a quick inspection. "Filing for case review," Hank explained to the clerk, sliding the first box across the counter. "Federal petition regarding judicial misconduct in Montgomery County." He tapped the top folder meaningfully. The clerk's eyes widened slightly as she began processing the paperwork. The sheer weight of evidence was impossible to ignore. Hundreds of pages documenting Judge Whitmore's pattern of discriminatory sentencing, financial connections to private prisons, and the wrongful imprisonment of 2 federal agents. Her fingers trembled slightly as she stamped the intake forms. Just 2 days later, Hank's office phone rang while he was reviewing another case. "Mr. Morrison, this is Peter Holloway with the Department of Justice." The federal investigator's voice was measured but interested. "I've been reviewing your petition regarding Judge Randall Whitmore. This is extensive." There was a pause as papers rustled in the background. "We've documented over 50 cases of clear bias," Hank replied, pulling up his case files on his computer, "including the recent imprisonment of 2 undercover FBI agents investigating systemic corruption. The pattern is undeniable." "I see that," Holloway said. "Send me everything else you have. Every scrap of evidence. The department is launching a preliminary inquiry." His tone suggested this was more than routine. While Hank worked with the federal investigator, Miss Loretta mobilized the community with remarkable efficiency. She organized meetings in church basements and community centers, gathering more testimonies from families affected by Whitmore's rulings. People lined up to tell their stories, some waiting hours for their chance to speak. "My boy got 10 years for stealing groceries," one mother shared tearfully, clutching a worn photograph to her chest. "First offense. Judge didn't even look at him during sentencing, just stamped his papers and sent him away like he was nothing." The stories poured in, one after another, each more heartbreaking than the last. Activists began flooding federal offices with letters demanding justice. Local civil rights groups organized peaceful protests outside the courthouse, their signs visible from Whitmore's chamber windows. Word reached Judge Whitmore through his network of informants. He made angry calls to political connections, trying to bury the investigation before it gained traction. His face flushed red as doors that had always opened for him suddenly remained closed. But the evidence was already moving through federal channels, unstoppable as a river. Hank sat at his desk late that evening, the office dark except for his desk lamp, reviewing Holloway's latest email with growing hope. The phone rang. It was the federal investigator again. "Morrison, we're going to need you to present this case to a federal panel," Holloway said, his voice carrying new urgency. "This goes deeper than just one judge. We're seeing connections to at least 3 counties." Hank turned to Loretta, who was organizing another stack of testimonies by the window. Their eyes met in silent understanding. "It's happening," he said, his voice steady with purpose. "This could be it. The beginning of real change." The morning sun hadn't yet risen when Judge Whitmore settled into his leather chair, phone pressed to his ear. "Listen carefully," he growled to State Corrections Director Matthews. "Those Carter boys are gathering intel inside Montgomery Correctional. They're a security risk that needs immediate containment." His fingers drummed impatiently on the polished mahogany desk, a family heirloom that had witnessed decades of his backroom dealings. Within hours, transfer papers moved through the system with suspicious speed. Whitmore's signature carried weight, and his carefully crafted story about potential security breaches raised just enough red flags without drawing scrutiny. Phone calls were made, favors called in, and officials who might have questioned the hasty transfer suddenly found themselves looking the other way. At 5:30 a.m. the next day, guards yanked Zayden and Zion from their bunks without warning. "Pack up," a guard barked, tossing them each a small box. "You're being transferred." The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cell block. The brothers exchanged quick glances as they were led out in shackles and chains. Zion caught sight of Rashawn watching from his cell, eyes wide with concern. A silent promise passed between them. Remember everything. Outside, an armored transport van waited, surrounded by 4 armed guards in tactical gear, their faces grim and unwelcoming. "Maximum security," one guard announced with a smirk. "Where troublemakers belong." He shoved Zion forward with unnecessary force, causing him to stumble against the van's metal steps. The 3-hour drive was silent and tense. The twins sat opposite each other, unable to speak freely with guards watching their every move. When they arrived at Stillwater Maximum Security Prison, the concrete walls loomed 40 feet high, topped with razor wire that glinted in the morning light. Guard towers dotted the perimeter, rifles visible in each window. The massive iron gates groaned open, swallowing the transport van like some ancient beast. Inside processing, the staff's hostility was immediate. "Strip search," a burly guard ordered. "Every cavity." The twins endured the humiliation in silence, knowing any protest would only make things worse. The cold air raised goosebumps on their skin as they stood exposed under the merciless gaze of men who saw them as nothing but numbers. "Separate cells," the head guard announced. "A wing for this one," he shoved Zayden forward. "D wing for the other, no contact." His voice carried a finality that sent a chill through both brothers. They were marched down different corridors, each flanked by 2 guards. Just before they split paths, Zion caught his brother's eye. A slight nod passed between them. Their silent language of reassurance developed over years of working together. In that brief moment, they communicated everything words couldn't say. Their cells were bare concrete boxes in solitary confinement. A thin mattress, steel toilet, small sink. No windows. The doors clanged shut with finality, leaving each brother alone in the dim fluorescent lighting that never turned off day or night. Zion sank to his knees on the cold floor. His whispered prayers echoed off the walls. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." His voice grew stronger with each word, finding comfort in the familiar verses that had sustained him through countless hardships. In his cell, Zayden found a tiny pencil stub left behind by a previous inmate. He began carefully documenting everything on the concrete wall. Dates, names, details they couldn't afford to forget. His methodical mind refused to surrender to despair. His hand pressed against the wall, separating him from his brother. "Hold on," he murmured, voice steady despite their circumstances. "This isn't over." The message was clear. Whitmore was done playing games. He meant to bury them so deep that no one would hear their truth. But even in separate cells, the twins' resolve remained unbroken. They had survived worse odds before. As darkness fell on their first night in Stillwater, they each found strength in knowing the other was fighting just as hard, just a few hundred yards away. Warden Stephen Kelly rubbed his tired eyes as he studied the transfer papers on his desk. 23 years in corrections had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about these documents felt wrong. The federal notation on the Carter twins' files, a small red stamp he'd never encountered before, stood out like a warning sign. He flipped through the pages again, the nagging feeling in his gut growing stronger with each document he reviewed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Kelly picked up his secure line phone, dialing a number he rarely used. "Jack? Steve Kelly here. Sorry to call so early, but I need your expertise on something." His old friend from FBI training answered with the familiar gruff voice Kelly remembered. The connection between them had remained strong despite the years and different career paths they'd chosen. As Kelly described the situation, his friend's tone changed. "The Carter twins? Hold on." Kelly heard typing in the background. "Steve, those boys are active federal agents. Their mission status is still classified, but they shouldn't be in max security. Something's very wrong here." The words confirmed Kelly's worst suspicions and sent a chill down his spine. Kelly's jaw tightened. He buzzed his secretary. "Get me Officer Mendez." While waiting, he pulled up more files, comparing transfer orders. Each one bore Judge Whitmore's signature, but the reasoning felt hollow. Security risks, flight risks, danger to other inmates. None of it added up. The pattern was too convenient, too calculated to be legitimate prison protocol. Officer Mendez entered, standing at attention. Kelly studied the young guard's face. "You came from Montgomery Correctional with the Carter twins. Tell me about them." He noticed the slight hesitation in Mendez's eyes, the telltale sign of someone weighing their words carefully. Mendez shifted slightly. "Sir, they're different, model inmates. They helped start a GED program, led prayer meetings, never caused trouble. He paused. Permission to speak freely, sir? Kelly nodded, leaning forward in his chair. Their transfer felt wrong. They were helping people, giving hope to younger inmates. Then suddenly they're labeled dangerous? It doesn't make sense. Mendez's voice grew stronger as he spoke, his conviction evident in every word. Kelly made notes as Mendez spoke, the picture growing clearer with each detail. He dismissed Mendez and began a systematic review of every transfer order from Whitmore's court over the past year. Patterns emerged. Predominantly young black men, minor offenses escalated to maximum sentences, sudden transfers when inmates showed signs of rehabilitation or leadership. The evidence of corruption was becoming impossible to ignore. From his window, Kelly watched the Carter twins in the yard below. They stood apart from other inmates, their posture alert but not aggressive. They moved with purpose, even under the weight of their chains. These weren't hardened criminals. They were trained professionals trying to survive. Even from this distance, he could see the discipline in their movements, the calculated awareness of everything around them. Kelly sat back down at his desk, pulling out a fresh incident report form. He wouldn't rush this. Everything had to be documented properly. But for the first time in years, he felt the familiar fire of justice that had drawn him to corrections work in the first place. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. It was about doing what was right. He looked at the small photo of his own twin daughters on his desk, now away at college. The Carter boys weren't much older. Kelly's pen moved across the paper, starting the internal review that would either confirm his suspicions or put them to rest. Whatever he discovered, he knew he couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not anymore. The early morning silence at Alabama Maximum Security Prison was broken by the arrival of 3 unmarked federal vehicles. 4 FBI agents, led by Senior Agent Marcus Thompson, strode purposefully through the front entrance. Their faces were set with determination as they flashed their credentials to the guards. Warden Kelly was waiting, a thick stack of files already prepared on his desk, his expression a mixture of relief and apprehension. "We've been gathering evidence since they arrived," Kelly explained, spreading out documents across his desk. His hands trembled slightly as he arranged the papers. The transfer orders didn't add up. Too many irregularities, things just didn't feel right from the beginning. The agents dove into the paperwork with practiced efficiency. Special Agent Sarah Chen's eyes widened as she traced financial records linking Judge Whitmore to Southeastern Corrections Corporation, a private prison contractor. Wire transfers, consulting fees, offshore accounts, all carefully hidden but now exposed under her trained eye. "Look at these sentencing patterns," another agent noted, spreading out statistical charts across the worn surface of the desk. Every defendant from Whitmore's court who couldn't afford private counsel got Renner as their public defender. Nearly all received maximum sentences. The numbers are far beyond statistical probability. In separate interview rooms, Zayden and Zion shared everything they'd documented. Zayden's methodical notes detailed dates, times, and conversations that exposed the corruption. His voice remained steady as he recounted each instance with precision. Zion's observations revealed the human cost, stories of lives destroyed by manufactured evidence and rushed judgments, told with compassion that moved even the hardened federal agents. "You maintained your cover even after being imprisoned," Agent Thompson remarked, impressed. He leaned forward, his pen tapping thoughtfully against his notepad. "That took extraordinary courage. Most would have broken." "We knew the truth would come out eventually," Zion replied quietly, his eyes reflecting inner strength. "We just had to hold on. Our grandmother always taught us that faith requires patience." The FBI team worked through the day, building an airtight case. They discovered Donnelly had been accepting kickbacks for every prisoner sent to private facilities, his greed documented in hidden accounts. Whitmore's harsh sentences weren't just racism, they were profit-driven, a calculated scheme that had destroyed countless lives. By late afternoon, the FBI had seen enough. They issued an immediate freeze on all prisoner transfers under Whitmore's authority. Agent Thompson made two important calls, one to the Bureau's field office ordering a full investigation, and another to a civil rights attorney named Hank Morrison, whose reputation for fighting injustice was legendary in legal circles. In the prison chapel, Zion gathered with the inmates one last time. Sunlight streamed through the small windows, casting a warm glow on the gathered men. "Don't lose faith," he told them, his voice strong and clear. "Change is coming. The truth always finds its way to the light. What was done in darkness will be revealed." Officer Mendez stood quietly by the door, a small smile on his face as he watched the scene unfold. He'd known from the start these brothers were different. Now he understood why. His years of experience had taught him to recognize genuine character. The FBI agents met with the twins one final time before departing. Agent Thompson extended his hand to each of them, his grip firm and respectful. "You've done good work," he said firmly. "You'll be out of here soon. What you've uncovered will change things for a lot of people." Zayden and Zion exchanged a look, years of determination and faith reflected in their eyes. In that silent moment, they shared the weight of their journey and the promise of justice finally taking shape. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prison grounds as heavy metal gates creaked open. Zayden and Zion Carter emerged, blinking in the bright light, their steps measured and dignified despite the chaos around them. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, and reporters thrust microphones forward, their voices creating a wall of sound that seemed to push against the twins like a physical force. "How does it feel to be free after everything you've endured? What message do you have for Judge Whitmore now that his corruption has been exposed? Will you continue your FBI work or take time to recover from this ordeal?" The twins remained silent, their faces composed but tired, with dark circles under their eyes betraying sleepless nights. They wore simple dark suits provided by Hank's office, a stark contrast to the prison uniforms they'd lived in for weeks. The fabric felt strange against their skin after so long, their eyes focused solely on two figures waiting just beyond the media frenzy, Miss Loretta Samuels and Hank Morrison, who stood tall with pride and relief etched across their faces. When they reached their supporters, the emotion finally broke through the careful masks they'd maintained. Loretta wrapped her arms around both young men at once, tears streaming down her weathered face, dampening their suit jackets. "My boys," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Thank God. Thank God." Hank's usually professional demeanor cracked as he embraced them next, his voice thick with emotion, his hand patting their backs with fatherly affection. Reverend James Matthews from Loretta's church stepped forward, his gray hair gleaming in the sunlight, raising his hands for silence. The crowd quieted as he offered a prayer of thanksgiving, his rich voice carrying across the prison yard like a healing balm. "Lord, we thank you for justice prevailing, for light breaking through darkness, and for bringing these faithful servants back to their community where they belong." Behind them, members of Loretta's church group began singing Amazing Grace, their voices rising clear and strong in the morning air. Many in the crowd joined in, creating a powerful chorus that seemed to wash away the heaviness of the past weeks. Some wiped tears from their eyes as the familiar melody touched something deep within them. Hank approached the microphone stand that had been set up, his expression serious, straightening his tie before speaking. "Today we witness not just the release of two innocent men, but the beginning of a larger conversation about justice in our state. The Carter brothers' case has exposed systematic corruption that can no longer be ignored or swept under the rug." Local activist groups held up colorful signs demanding judicial reform, their presence adding weight to Hank's words. Several former inmates who had been released through Hank's recent investigations stood quietly in support, wearing bright blue Justice for All t-shirts, their faces solemn with the memory of their own ordeals. The FBI's official spokesperson, Sarah Chen, delivered a brief statement confirming the twins' undercover mission and commending their bravery. Her crisp pantsuit and authoritative tone commanded respect from the gathered press. Agents Zayden and Zion Carter demonstrated exceptional courage and dedication to justice, even when facing personal persecution. Their sacrifice has already led to significant changes within our judicial system. Finally, the twins stepped forward together, shoulders touching in silent support. Zion spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling in his chest. "We thank everyone who stood by us and fought for truth when it would have been easier to look away," Zayden added, his deeper voice complimenting his brothers. "This isn't just about us. There are many others still inside who deserve justice. Our work isn't done until every wrongfully convicted person finds freedom." Loretta's church group presented the brothers with bouquets of white roses, the delicate blooms symbolizing new beginnings and hope reborn. Local community leaders handed Hank thick stacks of signed petitions calling for judicial reform and investigation into similar cases, the paper rustling as they exchanged hands. As the formal press conference concluded, Zayden and Zion walked toward a waiting black SUV, flanked by Loretta and Hank. The crowd's cheers swelled like a wave, and genuine smiles finally broke across the twins' faces, their first real smiles in weeks. The tension in their shoulders visibly eased as they breathed the free air. They were no longer prisoners. They were free. The crisp autumn morning brought an unexpected scene to the Montgomery County Courthouse. Federal agents in dark jackets moved swiftly through the marble halls, their footsteps echoing against the walls like thunder. Inside his chambers, Judge Randall Whitmore was reviewing case files, sipping his expensive coffee with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed himself untouchable when his heavy oak door burst open without warning. "Judge Whitmore, you're under arrest," announced the lead agent, holding up his badge that glinted in the morning light. "Please stand and place your hands behind your back." The judge's face drained of color, pale as fresh paper. His usual arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by naked fear as steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a finality that seemed to echo through the room. Down the hall, courthouse employees gathered in doorways, whispering and pointing, watching in stunned silence as the man who had terrorized so many for so long was led away in chains, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Across town, a similar scene played out at the sheriff's office. Clyde Donnelly's hand instinctively reached for his gun drawer when agents entered, but quickly thought better of it when he saw their numbers and determination. His deputies stood frozen like statues as their boss was cuffed and read his rights, the words hanging heavy in the air. "This is ridiculous," Donnelly shouted, his face red with rage, veins bulging at his temples. "Do you know who I am? I run this county." "Yes, sir, we do," replied an agent calmly, unmoved by the outburst. "That's precisely why we're here today." In a hotel conference room downtown, Hank Morrison sat with Loretta Samuels and the Carter twins, watching the arrests unfold on multiple news channels. Local stations had interrupted regular programming to show live helicopter footage of both men being escorted to waiting federal vehicles, their powerful positions now meaningless. "After a months-long investigation," reported one journalist, her voice barely containing her excitement, "federal authorities have uncovered what they describe as a vast criminal enterprise involving judicial corruption, civil rights violations, and illegal profiteering from the private prison system that has devastated countless lives." Zion squeezed his brother's hand tightly as they watched, their fingers interlocked in shared emotion. Neither spoke, but their eyes were fixed on the screen as Whitmore ducked into a black SUV, his judicial robes replaced by the heavy cloak of shame and public disgrace. "Files seized from multiple locations," continued the reporter, shuffling her notes, "indicate systematic discrimination and wrongful convictions spanning more than a decade, targeting primarily black defendants and other minorities." Loretta dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "All those families torn apart, all those years lost." The news showed crowds gathering outside the courthouse, growing larger by the minute, many holding handmade signs demanding justice and reform. Some were families of those wrongfully convicted, their faces a complex tapestry of vindication and lingering pain that no arrest could fully heal. Federal agents wheeled out cart after cart of documents from Whitmore's chambers and Donnelly's office, boxes stacked high with the evidence of their crimes. Computer hard drives and financial records were carefully logged as evidence by agents in blue gloves. The investigation had revealed kickbacks from private prison contractors, fabricated evidence in dozens of cases, and a pattern of civil rights violations that stunned even veteran investigators who thought they'd seen it all. The scale of corruption is unprecedented in this district, explained a Justice Department spokesperson on screen, her expression grave. We're looking at hundreds of cases that may need review and potential exonerations going back years. Hank stood and switched off the television with a decisive click. He turned to face the twins, his eyes bright with purpose. "This is just the start of something bigger," he said firmly, his voice filled with determination. "This is about changing the system itself." Zayden nodded in agreement, his expression thoughtful yet resolute. "No one should have to go through what we did. Not ever again." The bright studio lights warmed Zayden and Zion's faces as they sat on the plush couch beside Oprah Winfrey. The famous talk show host leaned forward, her expression compassionate, as the twins shared their harrowing journey with millions of viewers across America. The weight of their story hung in the air, electric and undeniable. "When they put those handcuffs on us," Zayden explained, his voice steady but touched with emotion, "we knew we had to stay strong. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone else trapped in that broken system. We became witnesses to injustice that most people never see." Zion nodded, adding, "Every day in that prison, we met good people serving harsh sentences for minor offenses. People who couldn't afford proper legal representation. People who lost everything because of prejudice disguised as justice. Fathers separated from children. Young men whose futures were stolen." The studio audience sat in rapt attention as the brothers described the corruption they'd uncovered. Many viewers dabbed at their eyes with tissues as the twins recounted specific cases they'd witnessed. Oprah asked thoughtful questions, drawing out details about Judge Whitmore's biased rulings and Sheriff Donnelly's intimidation tactics, her expressions shifting between disbelief and righteous indignation. "What kept you going during those darkest moments?" Oprah asked, genuine concern in her voice, leaning closer to the twins. Zion's eyes grew misty. "Prayer was my anchor. I remembered what our grandmother always told us, that faith shines brightest in the darkest places." He pulled out the small Bible he'd kept hidden during their imprisonment, now worn and precious, its pages dog-eared and marked with tiny notes in the margins. "These words sustained me when nothing else could." "And we had angels watching over us," Zayden added. "Our mother never stopped believing in us. She fought for us every single day. And Miss Loretta." His voice caught slightly, a rare crack in his composed demeanor. "That wonderful woman saw injustice and refused to stay silent even when it put her own safety at risk." The camera panned to where Loretta sat in the audience, tears streaming down her face as Oprah thanked her for her courage. The studio erupted in applause, everyone rising to their feet in appreciation of her bravery. Loretta's hands trembled as she acknowledged the recognition, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight, but proud of what she'd helped accomplish. Throughout the hour-long interview, the phones at Hank Morrison's office rang constantly. Viewers were calling in, sharing similar stories of judicial misconduct or offering support for reform efforts. Social media exploded with hashtags supporting the twins' cause. People from across the country were posting their own experiences with corrupt judges and law enforcement. "You know," Oprah said during a particularly moving moment, her voice dropping to that intimate tone that had made her America's confidant, "your story isn't just about two young men wrongly imprisoned. It's about every person who's ever faced injustice and felt powerless to fight back. It's about the system we've all allowed to exist." The twins shared knowing looks, a lifetime of understanding passing between them in an instant. Zayden spoke up. "That's why we're here today. To tell everyone watching, if you see something wrong, speak up. One voice becomes many, and many voices can't be ignored. The darkness thrives in silence." Another standing ovation filled the studio. In the audience, people wiped away tears and nodded in agreement, some clutching each other's hands in solidarity. The message was clear. Change was possible, but only if people were brave enough to demand it, only if they refused to look away from uncomfortable truths. As the show drew to a close, Oprah turned to the brothers with her characteristic warmth. "You're giving a voice to so many who never had one," she said softly, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Zion nodded, tears streaming freely down his face. "That's all we ever wanted. That's what makes everything we went through worth it. The Montgomery Community Center buzzed with energy as hundreds gathered for the launch of the Carter Justice Foundation. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the packed auditorium where Zayden and Zion Carter stood at the podium, their faces reflecting both determination and gratitude. The brothers wore matching navy suits, a symbol of their unity in this new chapter of their lives. 6 months ago, we were behind bars, Zayden began, his voice clear and strong. Today, we're here to ensure no one else faces that injustice alone. The crowd listened intently as he detailed their vision for legal aid clinics, educational programs, and advocacy work. His fingers gripped the podium, steadying himself as emotion threatened to overtake his carefully prepared speech. Miss Loretta sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. The delicate fabric was already damp with tears of pride. Beside her, Hank Morrison nodded approvingly, his briefcase filled with partnership agreements from top law schools across the country. The foundation would offer internships to promising students committed to civil rights law. His weathered face broke into a rare, full smile. Zion stepped forward, his presence commanding yet gentle. "Miss Loretta," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "you taught us that faith without action is empty. When everyone else turned away, you moved mountains." He gestured for her to join them on stage, where they presented her with a crystal award inscribed with words of gratitude. The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause as the elderly woman made her way up the steps, assisted by both brothers. The ceremony continued with announcements of major donations and partnerships. Law firms pledged pro bono hours, corporations offered funding, and community organizations promised volunteer support. The foundation's future looked secure. A large screen behind them displayed the foundation's logo, 2 interlocking hands forming a bridge toward justice. That afternoon, the twins visited the Montgomery Juvenile Detention Center. In a room full of young faces marked by hardship, Zayden and Zion shared their story. They spoke about choices, consequences, and the power of education. The teenagers leaned forward, many seeing hope for the first time in months. The harsh fluorescent lighting couldn't dim the spark of possibility igniting in their eyes. "Your past doesn't define your future," Zion told them, his words carrying the weight of experience. "We're here to help you find your path forward." Several boys wiped away tears as Zayden distributed information about the foundation's youth programs. One young man raised his hand and asked, "Did you ever feel like giving up?" The honest question hung in the air. Back at the community center, supporters mingled during the reception. Law students eagerly discussed internship opportunities with Hank, while Loretta introduced the twins to various community leaders. The press captured every moment, ensuring the foundation's message would reach far beyond Montgomery. Trays of refreshments circulated as conversations about justice and second chances filled the room. As evening approached, Zayden and Zion stood at the edge of the crowded room. Their mother's words echoed in their minds. "You were born to change the world." They exchanged a knowing glance and smiled. The setting sun cast golden light through the windows, illuminating a path forward they would walk together. The grand ballroom of Atlanta's Riverside Hotel sparkled with elegant decorations as hundreds of guests gathered for the Carter Justice Foundation's first annual gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables adorned with white roses and justice scales centerpieces. Soft music played in the background as attendees in formal attire mingled, their excited voices creating a tapestry of sound. The atmosphere hummed with purpose and celebration, a testament to how far they had come. Miss Loretta Samuels approached the podium with dignified steps, her silver hair gleaming under the lights, wearing a deep purple dress that seemed to reflect her royal spirit. A small gold cross pendant hung at her neck, catching the light with each movement. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone, all eyes drawn to her commanding presence. "1 year ago," she began, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the silence like a bell. "I sat in that courthouse and watched 2 innocent young men being led away in chains. Something in my spirit knew it wasn't right." She paused, looking directly at Zayden and Zion, her gaze full of maternal pride. Sometimes God puts us in places where we have to make a choice. Stay quiet and comfortable, or stand up and speak truth. And let me tell you, comfort never changed the world. The twins sat at the head table, both wearing matching navy suits with crisp white shirts and burgundy ties. Their eyes never left Loretta as she continued describing that pivotal day, her words painting a vivid picture of injustice confronted by courage. Zayden's thoughtful expression contrasted with Zion's barely contained emotion, yet both radiated the same quiet strength. When Zayden and Zion took the stage to present Hank's award, the energy in the room shifted to electric anticipation. Camera flashes sparkled throughout the audience as they unveiled a beautiful crystal plaque, inscribed with words of gratitude and honor. Hank Morrison, usually composed and professional in his charcoal gray suit, struggled to maintain his composure as he accepted it, his fingers tracing the engraved words. "This isn't just about me," Hank said, his voice thick with emotion, adjusting his glasses to hide the moisture in his eyes. "This is about a teacher who never stopped believing in her students, about two young men who turned their pain into purpose, about every person in this room who refuses to accept injustice as normal. Together, we've only just begun to fight." The foundation's development director, a woman in a sleek red dress, approached the microphone with a beaming smile and announced that evening's fundraising had broken all previous records, ensuring their work could expand to 3 new states. The news was met with thunderous applause, champagne glasses raised in celebration, and tears of joy glistening on many faces. Zion delivered the final speech of the night, his charismatic presence drawing everyone in like a magnet. "A year ago, we were numbers in a corrupt system. Today, we stand here as proof that justice can prevail when good people unite." He gestured to Loretta and Hank seated nearby, his hand movement encompassing their supporters. These heroes reminded us that hope doesn't die in the dark. It waits for a match to be struck. The gospel choir from Loretta's church filed onto the stage in perfect formation, their golden robes catching the light and creating a heavenly glow around them. As their rich harmonies filled the ballroom with a soul-stirring rendition of Amazing Grace, Zayden and Zion stood side by side, shoulders touching, watching the audience rise in a spontaneous standing ovation. Their voices joined together, strong and clear, rising above the music. Justice once denied now lives in our hands. If you enjoyed the story of Zayden, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. If you enjoyed the story of Zayden, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.